They methodically encroached upon provincial jurisdiction using the World Wars, the Great Depression, or any other national concern they could justify to gain greater control. This thing didn't happen overnight. You know, Canada never even had a tax system until 1917. Okay, but this quote from William Lionel Mackenzie, a Prime Minister of Canada, it really says it all. It takes this whole illusion and shows you what the real problem of it is. Until the control of the issuance of currency and credits restored to the government and recognize its most conspicuous and sacred responsibility, all talks of sovereignty of Parliament and of democracy is idle and futile. Once a nation parts with the control of its credit, it matters not who makes the laws. Usury, once in control, will wreck the nation. And that's what we're experiencing. That's why when you watch the news, the education system's collapsing, health system's collapsing, everything's collapsing. It's not collapsing because you're not paying enough taxes. It's collapsing because it was designed to collapse. Because someone came in many years ago and took over our monetary system. So how did income tax start? After they signed the Bank Act in 1913, it took 4 years for them to create and attach an income tax act to the people. You see, because of the fundamental foundation of our country, they couldn't just say, hey, people, you're going to have to pay income tax. They had to actually bring it in, and they had to bring it in under certain conditions. So first thing they did, they created World War I and passed the War Measures Act. You know, we look at that and say, what, they created it? Yes. These bankers, they finance both sides, and they pick and tell who's going to win. Okay? And then that allowed our government, our federal government, to pass the War Measures Act, which, because there was a national emergency, a concern, certain times, under certain acts like this, our federal government is allowed to leave its jurisdiction, to go and make laws it's normally not allowed to make. And one of them was entering the field of direct taxation. From there, the next year, they passed the Special War Revenue Act in 1915. Okay, they go to the people, you know, hey, the war, we got to do our patriotic duty, we got to pay taxes and stuff, we need a little bit. So they brought it in there. Next year, they said we need a little bit more money. They want to pass the Business Profit War Tax Act in 1916. Went to the people and said, we need more money, you know, we like our freedom, we need to pay for it, but we're only going to tax the businesses. So nobody really cared. Then they finally passed the War Income Tax Act in 1917. And that was the first time in Canada's history we had income tax. And yet today we think it's been around forever. But look at what they had to do just to get to that point. And even at that point it was unconstitutional, but they had the authority to do it under the War Measures Act, as it was a direct tax which was the exclusive jurisdiction of the provinces, but was considered a necessity because of the World Wars. And because it didn't affect the average person much like it does today, few people were even concerned or even bothered to question the legality. See, when you really look at this whole game in the big time frame, this had nothing to do with money. They didn't care if they made a penny off of it. They just needed to get an income tax act into Parliament, into the legislation. Okay, back then, I think for the average individual, it was 3% on the first $10,000, or 100,000, which is equivalent to like $300,000 today. We wouldn't be sitting in this room if income tax was 3% on the first $300,000 you made, would we? We would even tolerate that. Okay, that was not the intent. It was the illusion they brought it in. They triggered our patriotic duty. So once they had it in, and the bankers had control, now they could start moving it forward. In 1929, they created the Great Depression. It was set up. People knew what was going to happen in August before the Great Depression hit. I think it was in October or later that year. Okay? What they did, we were able to show the governments who actually controlled the monetary systems now. So with control of the stock markets, they caused hardships for many people. Now, with economic control and the ability to manipulate the economies, they cause booms and busts, creating hardships at will. See, they'd be able to create these cycles of good times, bad times, good times, bad times. And when you're in the bad time, guess what you'll line up for? Benefits. In 1940, they created the UIC card, which is really an indirect tax disguised as a benefit. That's how they had to actually bring it in. They disguised it as a benefit to get people to sign up for the card. And really at that point, it really had no grander detrimental illusion, because all it was, what they were trying to do with that, it was the start of their personalized tracking system and the attachment of the federal government giving them jurisdiction over those who applied. See, our federal government was not created with jurisdiction over our private lives. So it needed a way, it had no ability, no reason, a way to track us and stuff. Then in 1950, and through that period of time, they were infringing on provincial jurisdiction all over the place. And finally, in 1950, their control was challenged in the Lord Nelson case, which resulted in a Supreme Court order giving the federal government 12 years to remove themselves from the exclusive provincial jurisdictions, get this country back the way it was designed. Okay, and it was during these 12 years, from 1950 to 1962, they developed the illusion that we have today. what we're living in today, we never always lived in it. Okay, today they have a controlled federal government, which created corporations with the same names as the provinces, which gave the federal government control over these companies they just created. And with their illusionary country built, they can now pass laws that appear to invade real provincial jurisdiction, but do not. This allowed the federal government, which was controlled by the world bankers, to create a top-down power structure with a de facto federal government and enter into stuff like the provincial tax collection agreements by 1962. This is exactly what the Supreme Court told them they couldn't do, is enter into agreements with each other. So when you look at this from an unconstitutional point, it's evidence like this, you go in and says it's unconstitutional, until you get to the point where you actually see how they did it. So they created agreements like that with their federally created companies without violating the 1950 Supreme Court order or the B&A Act, the created document of this country. And the only thing they had to do now is to keep the people blind to their illusion by using the media to promote fear and create fictitious courts to punish anyone who refused to obey them. So that's a high-speed spin through history to give you a little bit of background of where this income tax came. It wasn't just there. So from 1962, here's what income tax is now. The illusion was built, and they just needed a few more laws to enslave the people en masse. In 1964, they introduced the Canada Pension Plan. It wasn't attached to anything. It's just, they offered it to the people, a retirement pension plan, if they'd use their social insurance number to work. Well, who wouldn't? They actually mass mailed social insurance cards all across this country. It was like, you use this to work and you'll have a retirement pension. And it was a really good pension. From what we've been able to study there, it was for every dollar you put in, you could get like $700 return. Great investment. It's not that way now. Some people are lucky to get what they even put in back out. Okay, but that's how they had it started. Okay, so people couldn't see anything beyond what it was. Then in 1967, they attached the Social Insurance number to the Income Tax Act, which by now was a modern version of the original War Income Tax Act, except for the fact that it was now constitutional, as the tax had turned into an indirect tax for created artificial persons and no longer applied to natural persons with inalienable human rights. And that happened all within that 12-year period. It was because of the supremacy of our human rights and the federal government's limited jurisdiction that they could only attach the Income Tax Act to an artificial person, as it was a legal entity, a legal person without human rights. And that's where it started to become important of understanding what your human rights are, because you'll be able to see certain laws can't even attach to you. You have to actually volunteer. And so over the years, we've been able to boil this down to what I call the simple reality. That's the brochure you have there. Income tax is nothing more than an internal federal excise tax, which is only mandatory for those who choose to work as a legal representative under an implied contract of service for the benefit of a federally created legal artificial person known as a taxpayer. And the same illusion is literally the same everywhere where human rights are recognized. This quote from Ronald Reagan, who just passed away. I like the guy because he was saying some good stuff, especially as he was getting up there in years. He goes, someone asked him about the taxpayer. He goes, oh, the taxpayer? That's someone who works for the federal government but doesn't have to take the civil service examination. And that's really what it is. And we're going to, as we get through, our whole goal is to be able to go inside that Income Tax Act so you can see that yourself. And by going that far in and you seeing it yourself, that's truly where your empowerment comes from. Okay? So start looking at this illusion, seeing through the illusion. I like looking at this children's story. Anybody here read that children's story, The Emperor's New Clothes? The essence of that, right? There was a couple rogue tailors who trying to scam the king there, and he goes, yes, we got this beautiful, beautiful yarn, fabric, but only people of true heart or righteous or whatever can actually see it. Well, the king didn't want to look like a fool, so, oh, yes, it's beautiful, it's beautiful. Well, that story spread around the kingdom that only people of pure of heart could actually see this fabric. So the tailors, they built this, or sewn together this beautiful garment and stuff, and everybody who came to see it in progress went, wow, that's really pretty, that's really nice, because nobody wanted to see, to feel bad about things. Until one day when the king was doing a parade through town, and everybody's going, ooh, ah, they saw what they were told to see, because they wanted to fit into society. And you start seeing the parallels of that story. Until one day a child standing on the side goes, hey, the king is naked. He saw things for what they were. See, he did not have a vested interest in the illusion that was created. There's a lot of wisdom in that story if you spend some time reading it. So, and I put this in here not to try to get you to see something that's not there, because I know how we've all been trained. We've been taught to see things that they want us to see, and you'll see that as we progress through. So simply use your God-given ability of innocent perception. We all have it. We all had it as kids. You know how when you take your kids out, you hope they don't say something? Okay, that's reality. So all we're asking is to see things for what they are, and you'll see what's there. So as we move on, before we even get into that, and this is why the first part, we've got to give you some tools to actually see through the illusion. And we need to start asking ourselves some questions like, who are you? When someone asks you that question, who are you, what do you answer? Do you answer with your possessions? Oh, I'm the owner of that big apartment there, or that house, or this. You know,